Welcome, everyone. I hope that you still have some energy for this concluding session of Safer Gambling Week 2025. And hopefully, you are tuned for some discussion about online self exclusion. My name is Šimon Vincze. I work as a head of safer gambling and sustainable gambling at Casino Guru. And with me is Tracy Parker, which is Senior Vice President for Responsible Gambling Council, and Dr. Margaret Carran, which is the Associate Professor in Law and Associate Dean at the City University of London, St. George's. I believe I have said all the names of the university. So, welcome everyone. Today, we will be discussing our latest work on online self-exclusion, which we've been working for past, I believe, 2 or 2.5 years. And our goal was to recommend best practice on online self-exclusion that could be helpful for operators and regulators as well. But there will be more on that later. So how today's webinar is going to look like, after this short intro, I will give the word to Dr. Margaret Carran so she can introduce the project more closely to us. And then we will move forward on the fireside chat. So our idea is to show you the actual recommendations from the paper in a form of a fireside chat. So I will be asking questions both to Dr. Margaret and Tracy, and they will be answering and by that portraying those specific recommendations and also showing sort of a sneak peeks on why it has been implemented, perhaps what was the issue when we were considering them, and how it looks finally in the paper. So without further ado, please, I am passing the word to Dr. Margaret Carran to give you the initial presentation and talk a little bit more about the project.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Shimon. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And just slight corrections with regards to the name. It's City St. George's University of London. That's where I'm coming from. So we have such an international audience here. So I will say good morning and good afternoon at the same time, depending on where you are currently located. So what I'm going to do first is go a very quick overview of our actual recommendations and a little bit about the methodology and what we are trying to achieve through the project. And then, as Shimon already indicated, we will go into more details as to why we're recommending a particular provisions as opposed to something, for example, different. But the presentation is focusing on some of the main recommendations. The actual text of the code is in the project itself, and it's significantly more extensive. But of course, there is no possibility in the short webinar to go through every single provision. So this is more intended to be a little bit as a teaser to you to encourage you to actually go and see the formal recommendations and the full text of our recommended code. So what we are trying to do is, if we are looking at the project overall, well, the aim of the project was to try to look through the whole different method of self-exclusions that currently are operational across different jurisdictions, shift through available literature, gather as much evidence as we can in order to identify what would be the optimal self-exclusion scheme, what would be the most important provisions, and how we should balance to make sure that the self-exclusion works for the players who need it as a gambling harm minimization tool rather than anything else, but at the same time it is feasible for the industry to implement it effectively. We had quite a few stages to the project, so it took essentially 4 stages in total, but our starting point was very extensive literature review of the existing evidence with regards to self-exclusion, what does and doesn't work, what is considered to be beneficial by the players, what the industry is happy or complaining about. And we looked at all the evidence that was available internationally that was not confined to any specific jurisdiction. Because one of the important part of the project was to try to make the recommendations as culturally relevant to any jurisdictions as possible, In other words, making it devoid of any specific country's interference and influences. So we have looked at international literature from all peer-reviewed articles, also from Gray articles, and perhaps surprisingly, you will find that the actual discussions about the self-exclusions and its specific component within the literature is quite limited. And this is because you have a lot of generic discussions, you have a lot of statement, and self-exclusion is one of the oldest safer gambling tool. Yet when you're looking at a specific component, each jurisdictions will have slightly different requirements. So each regulator or policymaker will be having a different expectations from the industry as to what they must comply with, will impose different obligations on the operators, will impose different obligations on the players, will impose different durations, and will impose a different mechanism as to how the self-exclusions can be initiated, how it can be terminated. And then when we're looking at the effectiveness, there is very little actual evidence within the existing academic literature that would conclusively point out to what works well and what doesn't. So we thought that, first of all, for something that has existed for such a long time, it would be really useful to go through it and identify what would be the optimal one. And that's what we have essentially done in the second stage of the project. And the second stage of the project was essentially a series of meetings of international experts who are specializing in gambling-related matters. We ensured that we have representative from every stakeholder groups that arguably exist. So we have representations from regulatory parties, we have representations from individuals with lived-in experience, we have representations from mental health treatment providers. We had, of course, inputs from academics, from the industry, from the regulatory and legal field. We also had input from sustainability principles, and we also had a member of the public that was looking at the perspective overall. So looking at the spread of the people that participated in the project, that actually allowed us to gather a very extensive insight and led us, you can imagine, to quite heated and very interesting discussion in the process. But through the process, through several meetings that took over the period of 2 years, we gone through the literature, we drew on our individual professional experience, we analyzed all the different perspectives, and then we agreed the preliminary draft code between ourselves. Then the code was sent out for international consultation, and actually it was quite exciting that we received a substantial number of responses from all over the world. So we had responses from Europe, North America, Canada, Asia, and different numbers, but overall we had quite a lot of input and very interesting feedback and discussions. So then based on the feedback, we met for the final few times in order to provide the final recommendations. And what we are presenting now is the final draft that is essentially built by a passionate group of individuals who thought that that would be a good activity to do and give an off-the-shelf solutions to new countries that may wish to implement self-exclusions and impose new requirements, but also to nudge existing countries that do have self-exclusions already well established to see if they can optimize it any better. So what are we recommending? Well, the content of the recommendation is essentially split into 9 overall parts. We have the basic statements in the project as to why we are doing it and what we're trying to achieve with it. But our section 1 deals with the general principles that specifies what self-exclusion is about and what all jurisdictions should aim to achieve. Section 2 deals with awareness raising and destigmatization of self-exclusion. Section 3 talks about how initiation of self-exclusion should take place. Section 4 deals with operators' responsibilities. Section 5, duration of self-exclusion. Section 6, panic button, which is perhaps the shortest form of self-exclusion. Section 7, we're talking about termination. Section 8, we're talking about organizational culture. And then the final section, Section 9, is a glossary, just to explain the terminology that has been used so it can be interpreted consistently. So again, as I already mentioned, I'm not able to go through all the recommendations that we are making. So here is just a snapshot of what we consider to be perhaps the most important, or sometimes may not necessarily be the most important, but to some extent perhaps a bit controversial. So something different to what is currently prevailing within the jurisdiction. Some of them will probably be very obvious, and some of them may not necessarily be so. So under the general principles, it may go without saying that we, of course, recommend that voluntary self-exclusion should be available to all gamblers in all jurisdictions. And this is one of the reasons as to why we're saying it, is because in Europe, for example, of course, all the countries will have self-exclusion already established, but that's not the same across the whole globe. We also specify that self-exclusion should be offered by every operator. And when it comes to the every operator, we recognize that there are national self-exclusion registers, and there are plenty of countries that do develop national self-exclusion schemes. And of course, if that is the case, that operators must subscribe to it. However, there are still plenty of jurisdictions that do not have a national self-exclusion schemes, which is why we say that operators should also be required to offer it. At the same time, we are recommending that even if there is a national self-exclusion register, we also feel that the operators should offer self-exclusions themselves, primarily to allow the players the flexibility and to preserve their autonomy so they can choose who they're excluding themselves from. We do recommend, under the general principles, that operators' self-exclusion should enable the gambler to exclude themselves from all gambling or from selected gambling activities provided by the operators. And again, this is protections of party autonomy to ensure that people are able to choose to exclude themselves either entirely, or if they're trying to use it as a help in order to minimize a particular form of gambling that they may find it particularly harmful. And the final recommendations from the general principle is that exclusions from all gambling activities should include exclusions from all activities offered by the operators and the operator's brand. And that should be a default position, that the default position should only be changeable upon the request of the player and provided they fully understand what they are requesting. In terms of the main recommendations, that something happened. I don't see the slides here at the moment in terms of the actual communication. So I'm going to go into the initiation of self-exclusion. So with regards to initiation of self-exclusions, our recommendation specifies that operators should ensure that gamblers can initiate self-exclusions at the first point of contact. And this is to ensure that they do not have to be obliged or have the need to speak to another person if they have already indicated that self-exclusion is something that they want to enter. We also recommend that initiation of self-exclusion should not be prevented or delayed on account of full identity verification of the gambler or on account of funds still being available in the gambling account. This is to recognize that sometimes players do experience frictions when they want to enter self-exclusion, and these frictions may sometimes cause them to reconsider or not enter the self-exclusions, even if this is the best course of actions for them. We also recommend that operators should offer a variety of options on how the self-exclusion should be initiated. And the main ones are essentially three, that they should be a possibility to initiate self-exclusions within the gambler's online accounts. But it's also important to ensure that players can initiate self-exclusions without entering the website, without having to open their gambling account, without actually having to go into any operator's website as well, which is why initiation through both simultaneous and non-simultaneous communication methods outside of gambler's account are also recommended. We also specify that when it comes to the initiation of self-exclusions, the responsibility of the operators is the most important one to remove the gamblers from all marketing activities, and this should happen within 24 hours of self-exclusion initiation or within 24 hours of identity verification. Now, with regards to the duration, that, as you can imagine, has been an interesting discussion because every country has got quite different durations from which the players can choose from. And of course, there is an increasing level of arguments that players should be able to set their own duration for as long as they wish. Ultimately, upon the discussions, we have agreed that self-exclusion duration should be selected by the gamblers from the options that are offered by the operators. But the options that should be offered should not be too short, and the self-exclusion itself should be for the duration of either 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, and indefinitely. We also recommend that players should be able to exclude themselves for the duration of their life, and we do say that operators should not discourage players from doing so if they wish to do so. Operators should also ensure that gamblers are able to restrict their gambling during specific dates and times on regular and recurring basis, such as weekend, paydays, major national sport events, without the need to enter into a full self-exclusion agreement. So in addition to the standard duration of the self-exclusions, we do recommend that players should have the ability to restrict their gambling for the particularly at-risk times that they may recognize themselves. The recommendations about the panic button is coming from the recognitions that sometimes the process of self-exclusions may be a little bit longer, and sometimes because of the consequences, people may be reluctant to initiate it, and they may need to have a quick respite that is immediate and automatic. So we do recommend that all gambling websites should include a panic button, and this panic button should allow gamblers to instantly block their ability to gamble on their given website for 24 hours. We do expect that this panic button should be located on all pages accessible to gamblers or within the application menu, so it should be visible everywhere. However, we do want to prevent accidental triggering of the panic button. So we do recommend that when a player does press the panic button on the website, there will be a pop-up window, but this pop-up window will only ask the players to confirm that they wish to be locked out of all gambling activity for 24 hours. And won't do anything else, would not have any information. This is just to prevent and minimize the risk of the panic button being triggered automatically. Now, we also recommend that if the panic button is initiated, and this is not accidental, which shouldn't be, bearing in mind that the confirmations pop-up button is pressed, then we believe that those individuals should be contacted by the operators, as they are probably some individuals who may be at risk. And this contact should take place within 3 days of the activation. Finally, the main recommendations with regards to termination. We do not recommend that self-exclusion should be revocable. If it is a temporary self-exclusion, we believe that it should last for the full durations of the period that was selected by the gambler. And temporary self-exclusion should not be revocable regardless of the reasons as to why this self-exclusion was initiated. We recognize that sometimes self-exclusion is not used for the purpose of gambling harm minimization, that sometimes it may be an expression of dissatisfactions with the provider, or there may be other reasons, but we believe that self-exclusion as a tool is primarily a gambling harm reduction tool. And it is not for the operators to decide whether someone should or should not be allowed to gamble once they have entered the initial duration. So the only exception to it is if the initial original registration was requested by third parties and was not authorized by the affected gambler, in which case, of course, then the affected persons would be allowed to terminate it. But otherwise, it should continue for as long as the player has originally selected. However, that of course is different for the indefinite self-exclusion, and that indefinite self-exclusion should be revocable, but not before the expiry of the maximum stipulated period of 5 years. So quite a lot of jurisdictions allow indefinite self-exclusions to be terminated upon the expiry of the minimum period within the given jurisdictions. We feel that if someone felt the need that they wanted to exclude themselves for life, they probably will need a more period of time to use it as a support to minimize their gambling or remove their gambling altogether, and should not be incentivized to come back. However, 5 years is a long period of time. So after the period of 5 years, it is perfectly feasible that players may have changed, their circumstances may have changed, and at that point, they should be permitted to remove themselves from the scheme should they choose to do so. We also recommend that self-exclusion should not terminate automatically, but should require gamblers to take an active step to resume gambling. And this is to make sure that people are not just automatically triggered back into gambling, but they actually positively want to do it. They're confident that they are now able to do it in a safer manner, and they are willing to take this active step to resume gambling. But no automatic terminations. And if the self exclusion has not been terminated by the gambler, we recommend that it will continue. We also don't think that gamblers should be reminded that the self-exclusion period is due to expire or has expired. Again, in some jurisdictions and even in some studies, the gamblers would say that they would like a reminder, and some operators would say that there is no harm in sending an information email to the players that the self-exclusion period has expired. But bearing in mind that nobody knows what the particular status of the particular player will be at the given time, that may represent a trigger. And we think that it would not be an appropriate thing to do, which is why we recommend that no notification should take place. But of course, players can always check if they wish to do so when their self exclusion period is due to expire, or it may have already expired. We also recognize that returning gamblers from self-exclusions are likely to be at higher risk of potentially suffering from gambling-related harm, which is why we consider them that they should be mandated, regardless of any other requirements, to set financial limits for at least 6 months. And they should also be encouraged to set up different limits, and the operators would need to monitor that as well. And the final bit with regards to the main operational culture, I have no idea what happened with the slides, but we can cover them during our fire chat later.
Yeah, sometimes they just all scrambled up when you start to presenting them. Yeah.
I have no idea why, because we checked them before and it was absolutely fine. But then there's the two bits, but we can cover those through our discussion, so
Yeah,
it
yeah.
shouldn't be too much of a problem.
We will get to it through the fireside chat. Thank you very much, Margaret, for giving us a deeper insights into the project, how the methodology looked like, and guiding us through some of the recommendations. Perhaps before we'll dive into the fireside chat, I can provide a little bit background on why we have started this project. And I decided to tell a little story about it because I like to tell stories. So it started back about 2.5 years ago, right? When we were still considering the global self-exclusion to be pushed forward through voluntarily participation of the operators. And one of the question was, if we will create a global system, what will be the details of it? How this self-exclusion should be implemented? And when I was looking for answer to it, I realized that there is nothing. That there is nothing which would provide a general recommendations or a best practice on how online self-exclusion should be run. And it was required because if you want to, convince someone to be part of this, chances are higher they will join if that is going to be reliable and if that is a quality implementation. And at the time, I came across work of Dr. Margaret Carran regarding standardization and looking into the European market and looking how certain areas of regulation, certain areas of responsible gambling is being used in different states. And basically, we started to discuss that It would be helpful if we have such code of practice for online self-exclusion, because then you can have the same amount of protection in different jurisdictions. More importantly, you have then ability to compare, but also it would be very helpful for jurisdictions which do not yet develop their own self-exclusion programs and their own self-exclusion requirements, that they can look in this work and they can consider it. And it will probably make their lives easier. Also, given the fact that even in jurisdictions where these requirements are put out, they are not very specific. So, if operators want to make sure that their self exclusion scheme, or basically their self exclusion system, is working effectively, they can use it as a guideline to guide it into the implementation. And finally, maybe some of you are thinking why we are looking at self-exclusion specifically, because it is a very old responsible gambling tool. Even though it has evolved from something that was a bit easier, or rather say less complicated at the time before online gambling. And now it has a lot of loopholes which are not always visible either by the operators or by the regulators. But these loopholes can be very influential when it comes to the journey of struggling players, and it can create unintentional consequences that could be harmful, that could basically miss the whole point of self-exclusion. So again, coming back to why we started this is to make this tool a bit more reliable for players, but also more practical and usable for the operators and regulators. So moving forward with the first question, and this one comes to or goes to Margaret. And you've mentioned as one of the recommendations that all gamblers should be notified about the safer gambling tools, including self-exclusion. And this might be a bit um, not controversial, but a bit challenging, because this is part of some of the critics that has been part of the broader consultation. So how you can justify that? How you can justify that all players should be notified about this when there is already so much that operators need to tell their customers? And some might feel that this will create an additional burden. And also not to mention that it might give an initial impression that gambling is inherently harmful. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I will try to do my best. Thank you, Shimon. I think it's quite important to explain the rationale behind it because, as you have identified, Shimon, it is something that the operators may say. There's already so much information that the players may have to be given at the beginning that it's really, most of them don't read it anyway. And also, you have the argument that this causes frictions, that players want to have as seamless account opening as possible. And we are recommending something that will essentially create potential, even if not a huge one, but potential some delay before a player can open an account. So we are completely aware of these considerations, and we had lots of discussions about it. But ultimately, we also have to recognize the two very important aspects of it. The first aspect is that, contrary to what a lot of people may think, the existence of self exclusion and safer gambling tools is not as well known among the players as we would like to believe. And when I started looking at the literature and when we're discussing it, there is a little bit of a paradox because we are dealing with gambling related research. Industry is sitting with it all the time. They are constantly exposed to this information. So to them and to researchers and to people involved in the gambling industry, self-exclusion is a normal and obvious thing, and everyone knows about it. Yet when you come outside the gambling industry and the people who are actual stakeholders within, you recognize that a lot of people don't even know what self-exclusion is. If you ask any people who are not even gamblers, who may wish to start at some point, they need an explanation of what it means and how. So we felt that it's very important that we need to highlight the existence of the self-exclusions and potentially other safer gambling tools early on, because it's an awareness raising aspect. And even when we started the project in 2023, even at that year, which is quite, you know, late, bearing in mind how long self-exclusion existed, there were plenty of studies that shows that one of the most common reasons as to why players do not engage with self-exclusion is actual lack of awareness. And they were citing lack of awareness as their main reasons as to why they didn't know that they can self-exclude themselves. So, giving these informations in a neutral and kind of informative way at the account opening will simply raise an awareness of its existence, and it will be in the background of people's minds when they need it, and may not necessarily be in having the best capacity at the time to actually look for the information there and then. So that was the first one. The second reasons as to why we really wanted to do it is because there is always the fear that highlighting safer gambling tools can give the impressions that gambling is harmful. But we do want to destigmatize the concept of safer gambling tools, including self exclusions. We want to show that this is something that may be relevant for anybody, everybody at some point in time, or not at all. But we want to treat it in a manner that is perceived as normal across the general populations, and not something that is only necessary for those who have serious problem and cannot control themselves. If we make it a widespread availability and information, and we treat it in a normal way, it will filter through, and slowly it will become recognized as something that is helpful or may be helpful to anyone at any particular period of time, and people should not be ashamed to use it.
Right. To your first point, as a result, I think it was very helpful that the part of the working group has a lay person in it, because then it gave us this out of the box insight that really self-exclusion is not something considered as normal as is among us or people from the industry. And I remember that we've spent some time about trying to design or basically suggest on how this sort of a communication can include. And I mean, I'm not sure at this moment, but does the recommendation include on how this should be communicated and what should be the tone? And if not, where do you think operators can gain inspiration on how to set up the right tone about informing about such a tool in a way that is connected with normalizing the tool and not putting it as a threat of gambling inherently being harmful?
Mm. We do offer quite a strict, well, strict, not strict, but quite a detailed guidelines on how the communication should take place. Now, in terms of inspirations, where they're going to get from, that's slightly difficult part, but we do ask the operators to actually test it with their players themselves. They have access to a massive data pool of people who can give a really good insight and really good feedback on the type of the communications that they do develop, and whether it works well or whether it doesn't work well, whether it triggers their attention or whether it doesn't. But we have made quite specific recommendations in the code itself to make sure that this information, first of all, is very concise. Secondly, is presented in a very neutral manner. So it is not trying to scare the potential players, that it's not trying to highlight that gambling, oh gosh, I need to self-exclude, so it's probably harmful to start with. Not, absolutely not. It's a pure awareness raising activity that also we want it to be interactive. Something that players not just tick box and then they just not read it or not engage with it, but something that will attract their attentions. So there is lots of details out there that can be drawn into it. And in many ways, I feel that using the people who design marketing to design advertisements that make it very attractive and very alluring for the purpose of designing those messages would also be particularly
Mhm.
useful because they
Right.
know how to attract attentions. They do it very successfully when it comes to inducing people to gamble, which is what their job is. And of course, they're doing a great job out of it. But they also could use the same skills and technique to promote the safer gambling tools and the social responsibility measures and the things that are there not to prevent them from gambling, but to make the choices better.
Mhm. Yeah, so it sounds like most probably the answer to the questions lies within their operation and within their data. They just need to switch their perspective towards the safer gambling a little bit. Thank you very much. I will move to Tracy and bring her on the stage finally after 30 minutes. So, Tracy, you've been one of the members of the work group, and I remember that we have long discussions about different areas of self-exclusion and specific recommendations. So, this one goes on the duration or durations of self-exclusion, which seems like a topic which has no beginning and no end because you will find a very difficult periods of time throughout different jurisdictions. So the question lies, why don't you recommend that the duration should be set completely by the gamblers themselves? And it should be entirely their choice for how long should it be, whether it is 2 weeks, 4 months, 12 months, and whatsoever. Why do we need to define some of those specific periods and not to leave it entirely on them?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And Margaret, thanks for the overview. It was a nice refresher on the process. It was a very interesting, year and a half to get to the point, and we did have a lot of really, really interesting discussions. Um, and for the point on duration, and it came up at several different points in time where we had to remind ourselves that what we were trying to do was design a program for harm reduction, right? Like it wasn't a tool for all the reasons and for all the people all the time. It was a harm reduction tool. And so breaks and short breaks and variations of limits and settings, we put that in there. Those tools are really, really important. Shorter breaks or longer breaks for whatever the reason. But from a prevention or harm reduction point of view, there is literature that shows a minimum term of 6 months gives better results. And when that was a key point made by the folks from the treatment community in the working group, those folks with lived experience in the working group, that if it's a harm reduction tool, people who are applying and using the tool, decision making isn't necessarily at fully functioning. And so, that if we're designing it for a harm reduction tool, that this would be, the best approach.
So I can also imagine, or I'm gonna extend it a little bit. So did you get into an account the stage that people are in, most probably when they are requesting self-exclusion? Because I remember
Hmm.
that this is the part of discussions as well that um, basically there is just a very short window in
Yeah.
which these players are definitively decided that they will enter self-exclusion, and then it can influence, I mean, the options they will get, or basically the process itself on how long is it take. It could influence whether they will
Hmm.
proceed with it or not.
Yeah.
So I mean, what role does this play?
Yeah, I mean, and we know that there's a lot of players that self-exclude multiple times. I think anyone who's tried to quit smoking, knows that recovery is not linear. And so I think the can it be all things to all people? I think it also goes back to what Margaret was saying about the research and the lack of research and the need for more uh, on like this is our best uh, positioning of what we currently know, but there's a lot we
Mhm.
still don't know about who uses self-exclusion, why they use it, what's effective. Surveying self-excluded players is a very delicate, very sensitive thing to do. So there's not a lot of really robust player survey data out there done with self-excluders. So we all have different scenarios about why it might work or why it won't work, or for this type of player or for that type of player. And so what we need to do is pilot and test and evaluate, right? Like we need to put, a line in the sand and say, this is what we know currently, this is what we recommend. Let's test it, let's evaluate it, let's see if that works. We'll come back to it, we can revisit, we can edit and evaluate. But I think with principles based on recovery and treatment, again, that the will it deter them is a real valid point.
Yeah.
But to put a line in the sand and to say, okay, this is what we think right now, is a place to start.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like there needs to be a balance in it, because as there is also a recommendation that is focused on a shorter self-exclusion, in which we talk about the possibility for the gamblers to decide. But it really depends when the player appears at that specific time. And ideally, they can something to hold on, but also if they wish, they would have also an option to set it them by themselves. Okay, thank you very much. Moving forward to Margaret again. And this one is on the recommendations for self-exclusion to be initiated at the first point of contact. The question is, why do you think this is appropriate when a lot of employees may not be fully aware of the schemes or what the gambler needs to be told?
Thank you, Shimon. I think you kind of answered my question already. So you ask the questions and you answer it, because this is where we are talking about the difference in culture's perspective and attitudes. The current approach to self-exclusion, safer gambling teams within gambling industry is often that this is the responsibility of a department. This is the responsibility of the safer gambling team. We have taken the approach that this actually is not very helpful, that we want the gambling employees, and I appreciate there is a huge turnover and everything, but we're not asking for an in-depth understanding of the self-exclusion, but we want everybody to be aware of the possibility of the self-exclusions, what it entails, what it involves, and the primary responsibilities on the part of the operators and on the part of the player, which means that we are hoping for a shift in culture here, that the organizational culture will play more emphasis on ensuring that everyone is aware of that. And if that is the case, then of course it doesn't become a problem that we recommend that the initiation should be initiated with the first point of contact. The reasons why we recommended it is because, as Tracy already said as well, thank you, Tracy, for reminding me of that, players often have very short window of opportunity when they are willing to do it. Often, if you cause a lot of frictions at the time where it is understandable to expect that they may have lots of anxieties, maybe under quite undue stress, to be bounced from person to person in order to actually do what is needed for them at the given time, may discourage them from entering it, may start creating self-doubts, may start saying, oh, maybe actually I don't want to do it now. And that could actually be particularly harmful to them. Whereas, if they're having it through the online account and they're not contacting anybody, it's absolutely fine. But if they do approach somebody within the customer service or through the chat room or through other methods of communications with the operators, and they're just being told, oh, I don't know anything about it, I will make sure you get passed on to somebody else. This is not a good customer service. This is not good for the players and for the organization itself. They should see that something so important is well known and recognized by everybody, and everyone is capable of explaining it and entering it, so the player can feel safe that they've done what they need to do without more.
Mhm. Right. Staying with you, Margaret, and moving on the recommendation that self-exclusion should not be delayed on account if there are any funds remaining. And if so, all funds should be transferred and refunded immediately. So no delays should be caused because of this fact. And it might seem that this is rather disproportion. It may seem that it
Disproportionate.
can. Right. What I was trying to say, it may seem that it may cause some troubles, and it might be perceived as a inappropriate by operators because very often there are just small amounts of money left in their accounts, and it can cause other requirements on resources, on human resources, when these small amounts should be transferred back to these individuals without them requesting it. So what is your ground on this? What is your rationale behind that?
Okay, thank you. Um, I think I need to start with some slight clarification of that. That the recommendation is that the initiation of the self-exclusion should not be delayed. The players should be able to enter self-exclusions whether there are any funds available in their account or not. However, the automatic refunds is subject to identity verification. So that is quite important because, of course, anti-money laundering legislations and all the other aspects have to be complied with. And if we had recommendations that allows players to deposit money into their account and then self-exclude themselves without identity verifications and then receive the money, that could potentially open up a loophole for money laundering, which nobody wants. But that's the only exceptions that we were essentially allowing. And that's primarily because we have identified through the discussions, and I'm sure Tracy and Shimon, you can remember some of the considerations about it, that there are plenty of gambling operators which are very good and doing a good job out of it. But there are plenty who are using it as a tactic to prevent the players from actually entering self-exclusion. And they're creating frictions that really shouldn't be there. And we don't want players to feel even more guilt or shame or difficulty in what arguably is a quite difficult period of their life. So that is one of the reasons as to why I wanted to make sure that it is as seamless as possible while still protecting the players and the industry from, falling into potential trouble.
Hmm?
We have discussed a lot about the amount to be returned. And we ultimately took the view that the only recommendations that can be made that would be feasible is that all money should be refunded automatically, regardless of the amount. And I do appreciate that it may feel disproportionate sometimes because a lot of the amounts that may be left in the account could be very small. And the cost of the transactions of returning it could actually be higher than the amount in question. But at the end of the day, those are the players' money. This is not something that the operator should be entitled to keep. There is also the practical considerations that if we set up a minimum amount that you need to have a minimum amount before it is refunded, and anything below, let's say, goes to charity. How are we going to set up the minimum amount? With reference points to what? Every country, every place will have different means. Every jurisdictions will have different levels of what a minimum amount and what could, for example, work in UK could not work in Canada or could not work in Africa. And one of our primary considerations was to make sure that our recommendations can work everywhere in any jurisdiction. Whereas if we started putting some arbitrary minimum amount or maximum amount, then we would not be able to justify that. There will be countries where it would work and others that it would not. So that was ultimately the kind of pragmatic compromise that we have ended up on.
Right, yeah. I mean, sometimes you just need to get to a common ground and put on some sort of a balance in order to put something out. Because I can add to this point that from the complaints that we are seeing, it is very common. It is very, very common that some operators might use things as KYC or having some funds in the account as reasons why to delay self-exclusion, because then the chances that players are gonna spend the money which are on the account are higher. And quite often this happens in cases where players have big wins and they want to protect themselves that they will not spend the money by playing, and they cannot proceed with this. So it should be very helpful in these cases. Turning back to Tracy, and this one is my favorite personally because I've had very long discussions about this, and also internally because um, we need to have our own policy when dealing with complaints on self-exclusion, and it is pretty much
Mm.
aligned. But with this one, I wasn't able to find a complete agreement. So it is a recommendation on the self-exclusion not to be revocable. Then what could happen in circumstances that the player's situation is going to change? Shouldn't it be down to parties' autonomy? I mean, when I imagine it, it could happen that players might be in a place where they could gamble with more control. So why shouldn't it be revocable?
Mm. Um, we have had a lot of interesting conversations about this one for sure. This was another hot topic within the group. I think it was, you know, I remember conversations where we reminded ourselves that this isn't an essential right to life, right? Like we're not denying access to any source of income or anything needed to survival. This is, and if we're saying gambling is entertainment, then sort of balancing, the essential rights to access that versus duty of care. And so this autonomy versus duty of care kind of debate came up a lot, right? In a lot of the different pieces where you're choosing, basically saying this is what's right for the player, and not allowing them to decide that for themselves. And so there is always a cultural context that these things are operationalized in, and these are interpreted by the players. But when we come back again to the fact that it's a harm minimization tool,
Mm-hmm.
and when you're developing a program that is meant to assist and help vulnerable people, people who are at risk, people who, are experiencing harm, I think you need to take, a really serious approach to duty of care.
Mm-hmm.
And it again, that balance to, worst case scenario, if they had access and or they didn't have access, it's, there, we hear about a lot of drives to the black market, and this would be one of them. But I don't think that's an excuse still not to do the right thing. If the right thing is to take care of your player and to take care of people, then, applying a duty of care lens to this and emphasizing that, given the role here in terms of harm minimization, comes out on top. And I think applying, and we, again, this is a lot of the times in the conversations where, we were trying as in our rational minds to apply rational solutions to very irrational behavior
Mm-hmm.
in irrational situations. And so while sometimes there's this really logical and rational line of logic, the situation that we're talking about, the people that we're trying to address, and the harms that we're trying to address are not being dealt with in a rational way. And so that's where, again, just, and Margaret, you were really good at just sort of pushing us to get something down and decide and consent. Like we need to, like, it would have taken us 7 years. It's like, right. Like if we could have debated these things forever and ever, but to be a pragmatic, to put something down. And again, like, I think this is a really important piece of work in terms of this is the best we know right now. Like at a point in time, here we go, test it, pilot it, operationalize it. I mean, there's all kinds of iterations on this. I think there's inputs that we could add going forward. I can't wait till the next, update for this in a couple of years, but where we layer in, I think the complaints access to, like, the data that you get from complaints is really important. The ability to engage with players in a meaningful way, in that, as sensitive and delicate as that cohort is to reach, treatment providers playing into this in a really systematic way. But at this point in time, based on the discussions we've had, Margaret's deep dive into the literature, I think it was a really important capture.
Thank you very much for this. It sounds like it comes down to liability as well, because like then
Sure.
if you allow the player in, then who takes the blame? Who takes the responsibility? And I guess that if you treat it, because there was part of our discussion as well, that we need to treat self-exclusion as what it was created for individuals who are struggling with gambling and who need to put on the stop and not anything else, even though in reality people use it for different reasons. But we should treat it as the tool what it was created for. And in that sense, then you are standing in front of the decision whether you will possibly deny someone's fun and someone entertainment, or you will possibly open door for someone to experience harm. And in this sense, the safer option is to choose the former, right, the first one, and deny the entertainment, unfortunately. Thank you. The last point which we have scheduled for this discussion is the panic button, which was also the very comprehensive discussion we had. So the critic or a concern regarding the panic button was that we've had data from Germany where panic button is implemented, is that players tend to use it unintentionally, and because it is on at all times, I mean visible on all times on the screen, there were cases that people basically entered the self-excluded period by an accident. What what would we need to ensure? What needs to be done in order to avoid this and basically replicate it on all places, to use of the panic button within the operators systems?
Yeah, thank you, Shimon. I think we don't need to panic too much about it because the number of accidental triggering is actually not that high as it may sometimes appear in some of the discussion forum. Of course, for the players who do trigger it accidentally, and for example, they are locked out, when their horse is finally coming through the finishing line, and that would be hugely problematic. But the reality of it is that the importance of the panic button is so significant because it creates an immediate and instant respite for a short period of time, but it allows the moment of reflections there and then before potentially someone goes into a spiraling down on trend. The reasons why we have introduced the pop-up button, which is to balance the risk. So we would hope that it will be visible from everywhere, but it won't be visible in the middle of the screen. So it's not as if it is going to be everywhere and constantly in the face of the players. It will be somewhere there, relatively easy to access, but not something that people would genuinely worry. And that would be up to the operators to decide where is the most convenient place to locate it. But also, if they do trigger it and they do have the pop-up button that tells them what they are doing, then this is the moment where they can't say they've done it accidentally. Because if they confirm what they're doing, that presumably that's what was their intention. And if they don't, they cancel it, then of course they will not be locked out in this process. And we made it very clear in the recommendations that the panic button and the pop-up window should only have the basic information, so not long questions or long statements that players may not read and still click something, but really simple confirmations that do you want to be excluded from gambling for 24 hours? That's
Right.
it. And in that process, that should help minimize accidental exposure. And conscious of time, but one other bit that I would want to add is that we did look at the different terminology for the panic button because we don't really like to have that sort of things visible on the screens. But we looked at all the different languages, and in the vast majority of languages, that actually is very easily recognized. It says, it does what it says on the tin. People recognize it, and there is no inherent stigmatization element in it. Thank you.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. I mean, at the beginning, we were discussing that we might not need the full 60 minutes for this webinar, but yeah, we just exceeded 60 minutes, right? And we depleted all our areas that we wanted to discuss. But there are a few questions from the audience, and I think it is appropriate to answer it because they are quite aligned. There has been a reaction from Isabel regarding the panic button, and it seems like it has been cleared out by your response, Margaret. But there is a specific question on the earliest removal of the self-exclusion, because the only option we have put in recommendation, the only cancellation revocability of the self-exclusion, is in case of an infinite self-exclusion, and that is only after 5 years. The question is why it is 5 years, why it's not 24 months, for example. We've discussed that partially when we were talking about this with Tracy, but why there is 5 years in case of indefinite self-exclusion?
Okay, who do you want to answer this? Me or Tracy? Tracy, that was your question, so I leave it to you.
Tracy?
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, I think it was an important indefinite was an important piece to add. I think in feedback we had from lived experience and from treatment, in that the players could be facing this in terms of the mental barrier of it ending wasn't necessarily comfortable, right? So this idea that it was never going to end at that point in time was an important option to have. It's very hard to operationalize that indefinitely, and so it was given that, I mean, again, it was one of those pragmatic decisions that we needed to make, and so in again, applying the principle of duty of care, what could be best in terms of a vulnerable at-risk player. The longest term in terms of irrevocability was seen as a point in time decision.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah, at some point you need to have a definitive line in indefinite because in
Yeah.
practicality, the operators just cannot keep it forever. And I just wanted to say thank you, Isabel, for being part of the discussion. There is nothing to be sorry about. It's very good that we have this extent of communication with people who are watching us. Still, I have one more question which has just beeped on my WhatsApp, and I wanted to provide an answer on where these recommendations lie in connection to a national self-exclusion. So how relevant are they to national self-exclusion systems? Please, Margaret.
Yeah, and there are clear statement in the recommendations itself that if there is a national self-exclusion register, that our primary recommendation is that the operator self-exclusion should work in conjunctions with the national self-exclusion register. And quite a lot of our recommendations, if you look at the details of the text, will actually apply regardless of whether it is a national self-exclusion or whether it is an operator self-exclusion. Because the only difference in reality is that operators, the players have to exclude themselves individually from all operators, whereas with national self-exclusions, they exclude themselves with one click from all the operators. But in terms of the duration, whether it is national or operator self-exclusions, the durations will be set up through jurisdictional requirements. And they should also consider whether their current recommendations of the durations are the most optimal one, or perhaps they could be reviewed. With regards to the cultural informations and what the gambling operators need to know, and their employees need to know whether there's a self-exclusion register or not. That still has to be implemented within the individual gambling operators and the licensees. When it comes to initiation, again, there should be a variety of initiation method, whether it is for national self-exclusions or whether it is for individual operator self-exclusion, and similar aspects of terminations and so on. There are some elements which, of course, would not apply to the national self-exclusion registers. They would be more exclusively if they are operator schemes, but they are quite clearly highlighted in the code as to what applies to any of the schemes and what would only be suitable for the operators one. But overall, more of our recommendations can be implemented for both types. So there is no problem in there. They can complement each other rather than compete with each other.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, and I appreciate that you are saying it because I remember that in the past we have a lot of discussions that these recommendations are not carved to stones, the only
Mhm.
one ways how to run a self-exclusion, and each organization can go either up or down with them depending on what their own data is saying, whether they
Mhm.
have a strong strong indications that something needs to be done in some way, then it's fairly acceptable that they are going to do it. This serves as a baseline, which should work on a general level in all cases, right? And prove me if I'm wrong, Margaret, but I remember that we were discussing this quite heavily. Um, I
I won't
guess
prove
it's.
you because you're not wrong here.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that our time is gone now. I just wanted to conclude this with a couple of last words from you, Margaret, as the chair and the leader of the work group, to tell us just a few words on what are our next steps with the code of conduct and with the paper. What is there to achieve with that?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think our ambition, of course, is for our recommended text to be adopted in any emerging jurisdictions because we hope that this is credible and really robust set of recommendations that could really represent an off-the-shelf solution for any of the countries that may at the moment be either thinking of introducing new requirements for self-exclusions or revising their existing self-exclusion requirement. We know that there are certain parts in the world where this is not yet quite as widespread as it may be in Europe, and we're hoping to influence those areas to make their self-exclusion schemes better, more effective, and we're happy to work with people who wants to do that. But we also hope that European regulators will kind of look at it and will look versus against their own self-exclusion requirements to see if potentially they may adjust their own in order to bring the overall standards common together. Because while we understand that the text may not necessarily be fully adopted in full everywhere, the closer we get to harmonized standards, the better the protections for the players, the better understanding, the better awareness, the better recognitions if, for example, something is coming from an illegal site, because they will be the odd ones out. And also, it could hopefully lead eventually to global standards that would ensure that all players, regardless of any jurisdictions where they are located or what they play with, can feel safer in the process. I have seen that you have posted a link to the full report and the recommendations, but it was very short period, so perhaps if you could also display it again or put it at the final end, I would recommend everyone to have a look if you're interested. And of course, I'm sure all of us are very happy to answer any questions at any subsequent times. Our contact details are in the report, and all correspondence, the primary correspondence should be addressed to me, and then I can always distribute it to the relevant group members as and if needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. It really sounds like the goal of this project is not only to develop these recommendations and basically do the work, but also work on having an impact. So it will not stay among the shelf of a research papers, but will be really implemented into the real world. And thank you for that. Regarding the link, it's also among the comments on our LinkedIn, and it will be added to the description of this LinkedIn event as well. And I think it's my duty now to say thank you to everyone. Thank you very much, ladies, for spending the time here with me, answering questions, and providing these insights. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone who has listened to us and watched us and stayed with us until the very end, 71 minutes, right? And also thank you for your questions and discussions. So it was great. And for everyone who was following sessions on Safer Gambling Week, have a nice weekend. It was very extensive, but also very important and helpful week when we were able to discuss important topics, learn much, and again, put a really strong kind of life into a safer gambling community. And thank you very much. Have some rest and goodbye.
Thank you from me as well, and thank you for organizing the sessions, and thank you for participations. It was great to be here, and I do apologize for the slight issues with the slides, but hopefully that was a real teaser to encourage people to look at the full text so you get all the recommendations in one place.
Right, right. That was the right hook. Okay. Take care.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.